Betrayal and Opportunity. A real key to the startup nation is to be found in two ingredients: an anti-hierarchical structure plus a whole lot of military high-tech experience. But Israel's success has also been forged in betrayal by a close ally, France, specifically the French Prime Minister during the 1960s, Charles de Gaulle. Flashback to 1950, the tripartite declaration that strictly limited arms sales to the Middle East. In those days, Israel had to figure out how to produce its own weapons. Exhibit A secret weapons factory hidden beneath a kibbutz laundry, preserved to this day as a testimony to Israel's spirit of survival. A few years later, in 1955, the Soviets made an arms sale to Egypt in the amount of $250 million. Egypt, being in a state of perpetual war with the Jewish state, this amounted to a clear and present danger. Fortunately for Israel, the Jewish state was on good terms with France, and de Gaulle countered the Soviet overtures to Egypt by transferring French arms to Israel. Then, in 1956, Egypt, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a definite geopolitical threat not only to Israel, but to Britain and France, who depended on the canal for their trade. Their plan: attack the canal, take it back from Nasser, and involve Israel in the assault. A deal was struck. Israel would aid in the Suez campaign in return for more arms. Israel would also help France undermine the anti-French resistance movement in Algeria. This would be mutually beneficial to both Israel and her most important European ally. But Israeli-French relations were destined to take a sharp turn for the worse, as de Gaulle shifted from supporting Israel to rapprochement with the Arabs. In 1967, de Gaulle cut Israel off at a critical moment, just before the Six-Day War. Israel had to fend for itself, which it did rather well. Nonetheless, France's next prime minister, Georges Pompidou, continued de Gaulle's policy, sending tanks and jets to the Arabs. The Israeli response? American-born engineer and businessman Al Schwimmer jumped into the action, procuring blueprints for the engine of the French Mirage fighter. Secondly, in 1970, 5 French gunboats, already bought and paid for by Israel, were commandeered and sailed across the Mediterranean to Israel. In the teeth of a gale that whipped the Mediterranean into a cauldron of 20-foot waves, the 5 Israeli-manned gunboats scooted to Haifa on a 3,000-mile dash from the northern French port of Cherbourg. At various points, they were tracked by French reconnaissance planes an RAF Canberra from Malta, Soviet tankers, the radar forests of the U.S. Sixth Fleet, television cameramen, and even Italian fishermen. Another success story. But Israel had another ace up its sleeve. By now, the U.S. was selling Israel an assortment of high-tech weapons, with President Kennedy, for example, transferring to the Israelis Hawk surface-to-air missiles. The upshot of all this was that the French betrayal convinced Israel to build its own weapons. That goal came to fruition in 1978 with the development of Israel's own Merkava tank. The Merkava is the main battle tank in service with the Israeli armed forces. The first Merkava Mk1 tanks were supplied to the Israeli Defense Forces in 1979. Production of the Mk1 continued up to 1983, when the IDF began to receive the Merkava Mk2. The Mk2 featured improved mobility, fire control system and armor, as well as the inclusion of an internal 60-millimeter mortar. Production of the Mk2 continued until 1990, when it was superseded by the Mk3. Then came the Nesher, vulture in Hebrew, Israel's version of the French Mirage fighter. The first Nesher prototype flew in September 1969, with production deliveries to the IAF beginning in May 1971 and ending in February 1974. These aircraft performed well during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, claiming over 100 kills. In 1973, Israel produced the Kfir fighter, an Israeli-built all-weather multi-role combat aircraft based on a modified French Dassault Mirage 5 airframe with Israeli avionics and an Israeli-built version of the General Electric J79 turbojet engine. But Israel's ultimate aerospace goal would be the development of an entirely new fighter in partnership with the United States, to be called the Lavi, with American-made engines. In 1982, the plane went into full-scale development. This time, however, Israel's dreams of aerospace glory would come crashing down. In 1986, the program was canceled by the U.S. Congress, then by the Israeli cabinet. As with everything else in Israel, there was instant controversy. Was the Lavi worth the effort? Had it all been a colossal waste? Some argued in the affirmative, but the plane had nonetheless proved to be a psychological breakthrough, for it had demonstrated that Israel had the know-how and the ability to build its own weapons. That same tech know-how would one day launch Israeli satellites and bring forth a new generation of avionics. It would also jumpstart Israel's high-tech boom that was just around the corner. In the short term, There was, of course, some attendant pain. Some 1,500 engineers lost their jobs as a result of the cancellation of the project. Some left the country for greener pastures, but most stayed put in Israel, and they provided an infusion of engineering talent into the whole private sector. Consider, for example, Yossi Gross, who founded 17 startups, filing some 300 patents. He went on to observe that when government owns industry, one can't really be an entrepreneur. Consider also the increase in military research and development following France's boycott that gave Israeli engineers incredibly valuable experience. So maybe Israel should actually thank France for its betrayal. But it had to be catalyzed by an interdisciplinary approach and a willingness to try anything, no matter how disruptive to societal norms. So let it be Googled, so let it be done.